Hello everyone, my name is Sam Westrop. I'm director of Islamist Watch, a project of the Middle East Forum. I've just come from the Hill, actually, where I've been lobbying on, among other things, Islamist financing issues. But the Middle East Forum isn't the only organization looking at this, and I'm delighted to be joined by two panelists, experts in their field, who have been studying this issue and indeed prosecuting this issue for a long time. On my left here, I have Jeff Breinholt, who was with the Department of Justice, where he took a key role in prosecuting many of the cases that touched on Islamist terror finance over the years. He's now with Program on Extremism at George Washington University. And further to my left is Ryan Mauro, investigative researcher for the Capital Research Center. We've known each other for quite a long time. Ryan is a familiar face, I think, to anyone who's watched the counter-Islamist field over the last few years and has seen the occasional Fox News broadcast. I'm delighted to be joined by them both. I'm going to insert some of my own thoughts into this panel, just because I have some very particular thoughts about Islamist financing. But the plan is to discuss Islamist financing today, its history, and where we think it's headed, and what the federal government, or indeed what governments should be doing about it. Now, we live in quite an interesting age. Tracking money is a lot easier now than it was 10, 20 years ago. Most Islamist movements operate lawfully. Even the jihadist groups make use of lawful institutions, charities, businesses, and so on, because they need money. And the easiest way to acquire money is to launder it through public infrastructure. Today, we have this wonderful situation in the United States where tax return data is published openly. Government spending data is available openly. And for the most part, it's pretty extensive, in some places comprehensive. So we're able to understand how money moves. We're able to understand how networks operate by looking at their finances, by seeing how one network funds another, by seeing how another network doesn't want to be involved with a particular Islamist group or network by not funding that person or group. Money tells us how, not just how finances move, but in which circles people move, and how ideas spread. We can see why the Salafis are not working with the Brotherhood, or the Brotherhood is beginning to work more with Jamaat-e-Islami, or all these different Islamist movements that are active in North America, active in Western Europe, and further afield for that matter. These data sets also allow us to see how money moves in from abroad and goes back out. So this is a fascinating time. We did not have this luxury 20 years ago. This is a relatively new phenomenon. And speculating how Islamist groups were financed, both the lawful and the jihadist, really only became corroborated or verified when the federal government stepped in and prosecuted, and discovery and various other measures unearthed information. We lived in a very different time. Now, back then, of course, you might remember all everyone talked about when it came to funding was Saudi. And that wasn't an unreasonable thing to say. Saudi was an excessive and proud funder of extremism around the world. Today, that's changed, as we'll get to in a bit. But Saudi, of course, didn't provide all the funding. There was some internal fundraising as well. And there were many charities set up within the West that raised money and then moved it abroad to places like the Gaza Strip, where it would benefit Islamists, especially Hamas, but other Islamist movements as well. So what I'd like to do with my two colleagues is go a little bit just through the last 20, 30 years, starting with the 2001 to 2008 era, looking at the Obama administration, and then end of Obama to present. We'd like to talk about everything from federal prosecutions to all the way to the campus protests today, and how everything interlinks and relates. Jeff, I'd like to start with you. Yeah. You worked in the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
It is an extremely important time post 9/11. Tell us your experience, your history with this subject.
Yeah, I want to take you back even further from 2001 to the early 1990s, because we were hit really by what most terrorism historians say was the first time we were ever hit by international terrorism, and that was the World Trade Center 1 back in 1993. And not long thereafter, there was a larger prosecution of Sheikh Rahman, who was planning urban warfare in Manhattan and the blowing up of Holland and Lincoln tunnels, et cetera, a lot of nasty things in the name of his group, which was AGAI. And at the time, there was talk of, and Americans were being killed in indiscriminate violence in Israel, starting in 1994. These were some massive attacks in Tel Aviv on the various shopping malls, if you recall. And I recall because I went out there to try to handle these murder cases when an American was killed. We generally deferred to the Israelis when it comes to prosecuting the assailants. But cooler minds prevailed, and we convinced Congress to give us in 1996, actually the one-year anniversary of the Oklahoma City case attack. They gave us what was called the crime of material support or resources, providing material support or resources to a group, an international group, that the United States has declared a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO. The new law in April 19th, 1996 said the US State Department is going to name, for all the world to see, those 3 dozen groups around the world that we think are involved in terrorism. And a lot of them were Islamic, not all of them though. Some of them were in Latin America, some of them were in Asia, some of them were in Europe. Think about some of the radical Marxist groups in Europe. But that's a long way of saying that when it came to prosecuting these cases, it really, all FTOs are equal in our minds. When I say our minds, I mean the minds of the DOJ prosecutors. So we could prosecute Al-Shabaab, or we could prosecute Boko Haram, or we could prosecute the FARC. It doesn't matter, it's the same crime. But what happened was after 9/11, the FBI had treated all of these cases as intelligence matters. So they were subject to FISA, which was off limits to prosecutors. And so when 9/11 hit, cooler minds prevailed, and we convinced the Attorney General to allow us, the prosecutors, who were all on the criminal side, to let us look at the intel, which was FISA, and all the evidence they have collected that some person in the United States is acting as an agent of a foreign terrorist organization, like PIDG or like Hamas. And so a lot of the Bureau's work before the wall came down were these Hamas fundraisers. There's been a reference to it in the last session. These fundraisers who were putting jars in community centers, and there was 2 successful groups of Hamas fundraisers in the early 2000s. There was a group in Chicago and a group in Richardson, Texas. And the group in Richardson, Texas, as those of you probably know, were eventually all convicted of what 2339B, the material support statute, was really meant for, which was a follow the money, a white collar case. This was a large $12 million per year charity that was systematically providing money to Hamas charities in Gaza. And it took us twice, didn't it, Steve? It took us twice. The first time we had a juror who was a Palestinian activist and ended up hanging the jury. So we had to try it twice with a better jury. But in 2008, we eventually convicted the entire board of directors of Holy Land, of the Holy Land Foundation, which was probably the high water mark for us going after Hamas in this country. There were a couple cases here and there, especially immigration cases here and there. But we also got involved in this thing that has been referred to in the last panel of the Grove Street. You remember the Grove Street? I think you mentioned it. Yeah, that became a very important address to us because in March of 2002, I think it was DHS got us an affidavit that allowed us to go into Grove Street. And probably the best, I wouldn't say it was a success, but one of the persons that we convicted sort of in happenstance was Abdul Rahman Al-Amoudi. You remember, does anybody remember Abdul Rahman Al-Amoudi, Zudi? Yeah, Dan? Yeah. Yeah, we get a phone call from the Brits at Heathrow. They say, we have your guy here. It's a Saturday afternoon. And we say, what did he do? And they said, he was about to exit Heathrow with $327,000 in US currency. What did he say about it? He said he was just trying to structure it back to the United States because he didn't want to be tagged with knowledge that this was going to support his charity. That was a lie. And what ended up happening is that through one thing led to another, and we started getting information that Abdul Rahman Al-Amoudi was actually working for Muammar Gaddafi.
That's right.
And his efforts included delivering money to a group of assassins who were on their way to kill Crown Prince Abdullah when he was alive. And so Abdul Rahman Al-Amoudi is in London talking to the Brits. They're secretly calling us saying, we're about to put him on a flight and he'll land at Dulles in 3 hours. And you guys got to figure out what we have him on. And we worked, Steve Ward actually was the lead prosecutor on that, and it was one of the, but it was a very important case, and he ended up getting 23 years when he owned up to the whole scheme. But it didn't get us what we wanted from the Grove Street investigation. The principals in that investigation ended up escaping charges, not for lack of effort on our part. One of the questions that I have, and then I'll stop and turn it over to these guys, is that the FBI, why the Obama administration wasn't as strong with Hamas, I think that's a point that you've put on, and that was because the Arab Spring hit. And we felt, or I should say we noticed from what the FBI was bringing us, that there were no more Hamas cases. They just ceased to exist. I don't think you could have pushed a Hamas case back in the Obama administration. But we got the Holy Land Foundation, we got Abdul Rahman Al-Amoudi, we got a number of other people, including some Al-Qaeda characters on the material support charge. And so that's really where I think your questions were directed at, is why was there such a sea change? Now, what's going to happen now? We see the same kind of stuff going on. Americans being kidnapped in Gaza and protests here. You don't think the FBI is going to start looking at Hamas fundraising in the United States?
Well, we definitely want to go on to the subject of now. For the moment, Ryan, can you stick to the sort of, well, I guess pre-2008 period, post 9/11, pre-2008, in other words, the Bush administration, and tell us about your experience, and sorry, no, actually go into the Obama administration as well.
Yeah.
Talk about your experience of investigating Islamist groups operating during this time, and as, if you can, your knowledge of their funding arrangements, especially as it relates to the Brotherhood and Hamas networks and so on.
Sure. So since I was actually in my teenage years, was when I first started working with basically every law enforcement agency I could find and find a reason to collaborate with, because that's how I had fun, whatever. I was a weird kid. And I would primarily basically gather evidence against extremists I would find online, pretend to be one of them, and that's kind of like what I did for fun until eventually became part of my career. And so that was more focused on like individual extremists, but I would say they were connected to different groups. And so that's where like the story kind of started. And then over the years, as I got more interested in groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, and I did a lot of research and writing related to them, none of which I need to particularly point out because you guys all get the point. You know that the Muslim Brotherhood is an extremist group and how they operate. But the real pinnacle of all that came during the Obama years when I was contacted by someone from the Office of Personnel Management, which was odd. You don't really think of that part of the government being involved in counterterrorism, but they had a counterterrorism agent that was working there who reached out and had seen some writing I had done on Islamic relief, which is, I would say they're probably the biggest, right? You know, it's, I don't know why it's got so loud. It's all right? Okay.
By revenue, certainly, yeah.
Yeah, by revenue, yeah.
At least in the aid charity sector.
Right, yep. So Islamic Relief is like a humanitarian group, and you look at their tax documents, and a lot of money was going overseas. So they would collect it from the US, and then it would go over to the UK, where the headquarters are, and then they would redistribute it, sometimes back to the United States. And so the agent reached out to me, and then that got me excited about the topic, and I just dug more and more. And Sam, by that point, had done some really critical work on it. So that really formed a good base for putting together this massive report and briefing that I gave to him. And then that kicked off, he said it actually sparked or reopened a federal investigation into Islamic relief. And then that grew to where I was providing information of a similar nature to about 8 or 9 other groups. And so based on my talking with him, it seemed like what it was leading towards, and he couldn't tell me the details, but he said basically I showed where the smoke was, and they found the fire. They found something that wasn't really disclosed to me. But it sounded as if this was going to be potentially the largest counterterrorism prosecution in US history, actually going above the Holy Land Foundation, if it moved forward. And then they thought that would then lead to these other groups potentially getting into trouble. And there's a lot of back and forth, and all of a sudden it just stopped. And I stopped hearing from the agent, and it was very strange. And then eventually I heard back from him, and he surprisingly actually said in writing what happened. He was like basically went over to the Obama Justice Department. They felt, him and the other agents, that they had a solid criminal case. They made a referral. It was the IRS, the FBI, and the Office of Personnel Management. And apparently Justice Department considered it and then just shut it down and didn't give a reason. But he said he and the other agents were speculating that it was because of political reasons. That would fit the pattern of what we had seen even beginning under the Bush years as they became more and more, or I should say less reluctant, more reluctant to do these types of prosecutions. So that's kind of like my contribution to that angle of things in terms of the story of the lack of prosecutions of some of these groups. But when it comes to the funding, which is where I'm a little bit more focused on nowadays at the Capital Research Center, because they're focused on political activity and their financiers in general. And then I specialize in extremist groups and hostile foreign influence operations. And based on the data, basically all of which came from you guys, thanks to Sam, the conclusion I have right now, and it's certainly not in my interest to say so, is that if you look at the annual budgets of these groups that are involved in spreading Islamism or are allied to Islamist causes, is that the amount of money they're getting from the foundations that we know about is like really minuscule. Like the data that Middle East Forum provided to me showed about $950,000 came from foundations to American Muslims for Palestine and Westpac, which is their fiscal sponsor. I'll explain that in a second. Since 2010. So $950,000 since 2010 for a group like American Muslims for Palestine isn't that much. And then you look at CARE, and I wrote an article with the top 20 financiers of CARE after Nihat Awad, the executive director, just blew my mind with just how stupid and reckless he was when he publicly celebrated the October 7th attacks. And I never thought that moment would come where we'd be able to just point to something in a single sentence and say, these are bad guys and here's how you know. We don't even have to talk about Muslim Brotherhood or anything complicated anymore. We just point that. And so I said, all right, well, let's look at the foundations giving him money, because I can't imagine that they would stand by this guy after that. And looking at that data, I was again surprised. Like the top source of money was the American Online Giving Foundation, which doesn't necessarily mean America Online is giving their own money. It could mean that it's people donating to America Online with the intention of it going to CARE. The data was only $1.6 million since 2010. So again, for a group like CARE, not that much. And unfortunately, when I followed up with the top 20 groups facilitating donations to CARE, I got a response from one of them. And that response was basically screw off. They fit our criteria for the type of charity that we're willing to facilitate money to, and this really generic statement that didn't respond at all to what I was saying in the question. I was like, did you see this? Are you aware of this? And they're just like, nope. Well, they didn't say no. They just said, we'll continue to allow financing to go through our network to get to them, and that's kind of the end of it. So you have to look at other ways that they may be financing themselves, and it seems like the vast majority of the money is going to be coming from big donors who we don't know, but I think we could probably identify over time.
So private donors as
Private
opposed
donors,
to
yes.
institutional. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so there's the big liberal type foundations that give money to what they consider to be left-wing causes, and what we found is that that's really small amounts, and then you have the more difficult job of trying to identify the big donors, which could be individuals or businesses, and I've done a little bit of work on it. I haven't quite found the smoking gun to identify the entire circle, but the only way you can find that out is either through covert means, or you closely follow their public statements, see who they're honoring, if there's a fundraiser for them, see who the chairman is, whose name is basically brought up unnecessarily into conversations and publications where it's like they're bringing attention to someone without saying necessarily you are a donor. Sometimes they will say this is a donor, thank you for your support, but other times it's a little bit more veiled. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that they can hide money, and that's what really makes it so difficult. The most common one is through donor-advised funds, which is where you park your money to like a bank's account for giving money to charities. And basically what it's for is you put your money there so you can get the tax write-off for that year, and then later on, maybe 2-3 years later, whenever, you can then direct whoever's holding that money to then give it to a charity. And the result of that is that in terms of the data, all that shows up on the tax forms is the transaction from the donor-advised fund, like a Morgan Stanley charitable fund or something like that, to the organization. So where it actually originated from is completely hidden. And that's a very common thing in the nonprofit world, and especially with groups like this. There's tricks that they could be using, probably are using, but I can't necessarily prove, just in terms of the regular 990s that they file. If they want to hide something, they put it under a program expense, as opposed to saying this is a direct hire or part of something else. You just say, oh, I'm setting up a program for education. And then they just decide what should be filed under there, and they hide any detail that way. The arrangement that is getting the most attention now is fiscal sponsorship, which is where an organization that sounds like a nut.
Can I stop us there and come back to that?
Okay, yeah.
Very short while. And just one quick question before I go back to Jeff, is have you any sense, and again, very difficult to know because we have data now, but we didn't have 10 years ago.
Right.
Do you have any sense if the funding sources have changed in the last, say, 10, 15 years for these American Islamist groups? Just anecdotally from you.
Okay, so I would say it definitely appears that there used to be more traditional type donors that are part of the Muslim or Arab communities and might be giving not for necessarily a political cause, it's just part of being part of the community and their faith practice. And then now there's just some indications that some of the more social justice focused organizations are providing money. And that happens for a few different reasons. Number one, if you're an Islamic organization, but Islamic issues are not in the news, it makes sense to pivot to something else because you can't fundraise as well for an issue that's not in the news. But then on other occasions, if Islamic issues are in the news and you represent a pro-transgender organization that previously might have been getting some attention for something, well, now your attention went away, so you now have to prove to your donors that you're doing something on this other issue in order to keep them on board and for you to have a job. And so they give a grant to an Islamic organization or cooperate with them on something so they can say, oh, look, we're making a mark there. So the intersectionality is yeah, there's an ideological component to it, an operational, it makes sense strategically, but some of it is just about financial survival and maximizing profit.
That makes sense. But was there any sense in your work, say, over 5 years ago, of foreign funding? That was always the rumor, right? That American Islamism was somehow largely foreign funded. Personally, I never really saw the hard data to back that up at all.
Right, no.
Do you think they were just good at hiding it, or is it your sense that that was probably an exaggerated
I don't think it was exaggerated because there are so many ways to hide it, especially if you're operating through mosques, houses of worship. I mean, you don't have to declare like anything. So I would assume it's going on, especially because you would consistently see things like officials from foreign governments participating in events, the choices of like certain issues that they would pop up. It was like the Saudis in the beginning were like always there. And you would hear about like, oh, thank you for a building. It was in the name of this Saudi. And then it's over time, as I'm sure everyone has noticed, switched more to like Qatar and Turkey, especially. So that's the only shift. I didn't come across anything where I could say, oh, there's this specific fundraising mechanism to get money from overseas, and this way, I don't know.
Okay. Jeff, you mentioned the Virginia-based groups.
Yes.
Also known as the Sapper Network, for those who've heard the term. Today, the Sapper Network is still very much in operation.
Yep.
You mentioned you got one good byproduct out of that original investigation 20 years ago. Why did the federal government drop the investigation into Sapper? It seemed to me Al-Moody was just one piece of a much broader, dangerous puzzle.
My sense, and I don't know if this is a theory, but my sense is it was a DHS case that they were not ready to handle. And the FBI washed its hands of it because it was a DHS case.
Interesting. Now, something that I've come across time and time again is the fact that around the time of the Arab Spring, the Obama administration, but also governments elsewhere in the West, started to regard Islamist charities from the Muslim Brotherhood tradition as potential assets, especially in the counterintelligence, in the intelligence field. There was a sense that if Al-Qaeda and ISIS and similar Salafi jihadist groups pose a very distinct threat to American safety, groups like Hamas don't. They're a Palestinian issue, and we may as well make use of them. We may as well get actionable intelligence from them and help stop these ISIS and Al-Qaeda terror attacks. Did you have a sense that something like that was underpinning perhaps the political thinking that was influenced?
Yeah, and although what I remember more directly is that when Morsi looked like he was going to win in Egypt, the Obama administration got behind it because people were saying the Muslim Brotherhood has never been tested as a government. And Morsi was showing signs that he might be a successful president. Didn't last very long. In fact, I don't know that he's alive anymore. Did he die?
He's dead.
He died, yeah. He's not alive anymore.
Oh, yeah.
2 or 3 years ago, yeah.
Yeah. In prison, yeah. Is that consistent with what your experience is in Egypt? Is that?
Yes, we were very angry at the time that the Obama administration
Yeah.
had the Muslim Brotherhood, and actually I was working at Ibn Khaldun Center at that time, a few meters away from the headquarters of the Muslim Brotherhood in Muqattam, and I was all the time seeing like cars of the American embassy
Yeah.
and the American ambassador going back and forth there. And I remember even we hosted the American ambassador a few days before the start of the rebellion again as the Muslim Brotherhood, and she was defending the Muslim Brotherhood fiercely and saying like,
Yeah.
Morsi is not Mubarak.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah.
And then it turned out. Yeah. I don't know if Dan might remember this. There were a remarkable number of conservative intellectuals who were recommending us getting in bed with the Muslim Brotherhood at that time. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
That's exactly what,
Groups and yeah.
Mauro, yeah.
People and groups, as mentioning Grover Norquist, who were linked to the Sapper Network.
Right.
So a beautiful
Right.
circle there. But it wasn't just Hamas. There were plenty of other
Yeah.
Islamist groups operating.
Yeah.
I mean, take South Asia, for example. You have a huge number of South Asian, in fact, South Asian Muslims are the plurality of Muslims in this country. And they operate their own distinct Islamist networks, which include Islamist charities and include Islamist terror finance. And I know this wasn't your specific focus, but in Kashmir, a lot of these jihadist groups enjoy support from American 501c(s), and we can give examples later of that. But one would expect that DOJ would be prosecuting these networks as well. So it seems just from my very non-governmental perspective, it wasn't just a withdrawal from the Brotherhood, it was a withdrawal from prosecuting all Islamist terror finance except for Iranian and Salafi jihad. Is that about right?
That's about right, although we had a good record of either prosecuting or designating American charities back in the early 2000s. And part of that was the Treasury got very bullish on the designation process. So the Holy Land Foundation itself was actually designated as a terrorist group before we indicted them. You could take designations of Islamic charities and look at them as a farm team for further scrutiny, because if they're designated, it's the first step toward that element if you're a prosecutor. Yeah, or anything, and then they keep. Well, actually, Zudi, there's something I tell my students, and that is, if you're gonna wake up and go reform another employer because your first employer has gotten too hot, there's a question on the application for the IRS 501c3 status that says, have you been, or are you, it says, I screwed it up. It says, are you an outgrowth of or successor to another organization? And as I tell my students, of the terrorist-affiliated or Islamist-affiliated charities that are out there, how many are lying on their application?
Then they recruit the main imam in Phoenix.
Right.
Left his pulpit to run Kind Hearts because the Holy Land Foundation guys were all poisoned.
Yeah.
So they did take some new people, and he lasted 4 or 5 years there.
Right. Right. And that's a legitimate way of seeing what the new generation is up to, is find out where they are. And who was doing that work? Who was doing a lot of that work recently? It was, he testified, or the guy at FDD.
Shanzer.
Shanzer, yeah. Yeah, he's done a real good effort at sort of the longitudinal study of where they are now.
So I want to actually come back to Shanzer's research in a second when we talk about charities. But just one last question on the federal role. We've mentioned a couple of possible reasons for declining federal interest in the subject. The last one I wanted to ask you about was pushback from American Muslims and Western Muslims in general, especially accusations of Islamophobia or some kind of anti-Muslim sentiment.
Yeah.
And the case study I wanted to use is just, I don't know if you're involved with this designation, but was the designation of Interpal, the UK charity.
UK charity, right.
I've followed them personally for years, and it's very clear to me they're a Hamas charity. They go to Gaza, they carry bags of cash, they give them to Ismail Haniyeh or whoever's in Gaza at the time, and then they take part in big Hamas parades where they sing songs about killing Jews.
Right.
It's very clear the Americans made the right choice when they decided to designate this group. Nonetheless, it is the official position of the British government, and indeed the British Charity Commission, that this was overreach. And this charity is an innocent charity doing good work, helping starving people and building homes for the homeless and so on. The British government's response to the Americans has been tinged, sort of highlighted with accusations that this was part of the post-9/11 anti-Muslim emotional response that underpinned too much of American policy. Was this a common accusation that you encountered?
Yes, Islamophobia it was a fairly new term. I don't think it existed 20 years ago.
Yeah, 97 was the first
97
use,
was the
but
first
it wasn't
use of it.
widespread until well into the 2000s.
Yeah, we would get those arguments increasingly as the 2000s rolled around, and they were fairly diligent about going into our building and getting our political leaders and talking to them about further outreach and partnering up with when it comes to de-radicalization, which is ironic.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, I think the last time I was at Hudson Institute, I actually did speak about how Islamists run the counter-Islamism industry, at least in the eyes of Department for Homeland Security. So that's a very interesting problem and related to the funding one. So, but in other words, just to clarify, the lawful Islamists were lobbying DOJ not to prosecute their unlawful brethren. That was essentially the push. Okay, I want to talk about current funding, and then I want to start talking about solutions and what we can do and what we will do to stop this, or at least change this. The last thing I want to do to demonstrate the problem, however, relates to a few statistics. And Ryan, I want to ask you a little more about the 501c system and what Capital Research Center and you are doing in a second. But first off, I just wanted to give a sense of the amount of money we're talking about here in the present day. So there are about 6,000 to 8,000 Islamic organizations in the US. I use that 6,000 to 8,000 because not all of them are incorporated. Some of them are backroom mosques. Others are sister projects of existing institutions, or indeed, as we discussed, related organizations that are reforming and so on. But of those 6,000 to 8,000, 5,000 are 501c3, or sorry, 501c organizations. That's mostly C3, but it includes a number of other C types among them. Of those 5,000 501cs, about half, just over half, in fact, file tax returns, file 990 tax returns.
Yeah.
This allows us, in this age of electronically filed tax returns, to get a sense of the money, get a sense of how the money moves, get a sense of revenue, of expenses, of assets, and a few other interesting fields. The Middle East Forum has been running these numbers for quite a while now, and we download each new trove of IRS-released data and see what's there. We cross-reference against this huge list of Islamic organizations we have, of which we believe just over a third, if not more, closer to half, have Islamist links. What this shows is that American Islam as a whole, so I'm not just talking about the Islamists here, but Islam. American Islam has just over $3.2 billion of assets, and that's probably undercounting, because until just last year, not all organizations filed electronically. So the real figure is probably likely higher, but let's assume 3.2 billion. Revenue stands at around 1.8 billion. These are staggering.
Yeah, higher than most GNPs in the country.
I mean, higher than the budget of smaller countries. Yeah. So these are extraordinary sums. This is not a small community group or a small group of radicals with a loud voice. This is something much more serious. This is serious economic clout that they have at their disposal. Now, one of the wealthiest networks is actually still the Sapper Network, the very series of institutions that Jeff mentioned. And the Sapper Network today is not sort of, I think it was 30 or 40 organizations when you looked at it. Now it's nearer 100. And it includes not just mosques and think tanks such as the International Institute of Islamic Thought, a very prominent Brotherhood think tank, but now it's universities, banks, financial institutions, poultry businesses. They control half the poultry production in Georgia, of all places. It's an astonishing array of institutions, and it is the most beautiful money laundering setup I think I've ever seen. And the ability for it to move money is unparalleled. And I'll just give an example of why this is so interesting using the Sapper Network, because the old story was that money came from east to west. Saudi was funding American Islamism. The understanding was that once Saudi stepped back from the Islamist game, that Qatar and Turkey, just as you said, had taken over. But we never really saw the money coming from Qatar and Turkey that we did with the Saudis. So where's the money coming from? So what we're starting to realize with these scrapes of these vast amounts of data is that money is no longer moving from east to west. It's west to east. And indeed, if you look across the Islamist world, from Indonesia to Pakistan to Syria, Muslims in those countries look to Western imams for ideological advice, and they look to Western Islamist charities for money. The West has become the exporter of radical Islam, which is such an extraordinary turnaround from even 5-10 years ago. So this is a fascinating change, and the returns show this. An anecdotal study of the most popular imams of the world, of institutions and movements of monies show this as well. The Sapper Network, in fact, is so important internationally, thanks to its money, thanks to its finances, that it recently appointed the latest Prime Minister of Malaysia. Anwar Ibrahim is a graduate of the Sapper Network. Indeed, he remains the head of the International Institute for Islamic Thought. This Virginia think tank runs the country of Malaysia. Now, what is the Prime Minister of Malaysia doing right now with this enormous power and money? It is using ideas cooked up in Virginia at the International Institute of Islamic Thought with their $1 billion of assets and their huge amounts of connections and influence over American Islamism and increasingly American politicians. They're using all the ideas cooked up there about how an Islamic state should look and testing them in Malaysia. They're starting with the schools. They're implementing something called Tarbiyah, which is, well, it means education, but in the Muslim Brotherhood sense, it refers to a very specific theory of education, integrating Islamist ideas with every subject imaginable and re-radicalizing and over-radicalizing the next generation of Muslim students. So this is the power of finances in the West, of Islamist finances in the West. I wanted to give just a sense of the sheer scale of this. And I went to one other thing before I turn to Ryan, which is a subject I also want Ryan and Jeff to address if they can, and that's government funding. Despite the enormous growth of wealth by American Islamists, indeed by Islamists across the West, government funding has increased exponentially. It is utterly extraordinary. Now, when we scrape federal spending data, we find well over 150 million of federal and state data. That is probably wildly undercounting, because the federal government does not keep good records. I keep finding grants that are not in federal records that I know were made, but also state government doesn't publish most of its spending. So many FOIAs later, maybe I'll have a figure that's 3 or 4 times bigger for you. But if we're assuming 150 million a year to Islamist, Islamic organizations, of which many are Islamist, from all across the country, that figure is dwarfed by a figure we recently scraped from tax returns. There's a very interesting field in 990 tax returns where you list government grants. And just taking the last 7 years of scrapable electronic tax returns, we found over $700 million reported in government grants by those 4,500 to 5,000 501c filing in the United States. 700 million. Now, it's possible that some of these groups were reporting foreign money, which might actually turn my entire theory on its head and mean that there is more foreign government money than we realize. Or it could be all federal, or it could be all state, or a mix of all three. We don't know. Either way, taxpayers, whether in this country or around the world, are helping an already very wealthy collection of radical networks get even wealthier and use that money to, well, run countries like Malaysia. So something needs to be done about this quite clearly. And I think it probably starts with the 501c system. Now, Ryan, Capital Research Center is sort of the expert group on studying all these foundations and organizations that underpin, well, all sorts of extremism, but you know, your focus is Islamism. What is the, I mean, you mentioned a few foundations earlier. Are these just a couple that happen to be funding Islamists, or is the problem more broad than that?
Well, the problem, it depends on how you define it. So you have, like I said, like the Morgan Stanley charitable type funds that are just, they're not providing their own funds, they're just facilitating it. And so that's one layer of problems. And then you do have, like we said, the bigger, more left-leaning foundations that give a little bit that way. And then there's just a whole lot of unknown. And the one scheme that is often used and abused is that for situations where someone needs a nonprofit immediately, and it takes some time to do that, you can legally set up what's called a fiscal sponsorship. And that means you go to an established nonprofit and you basically run a nonprofit through them. They facilitate, the most important part is that they facilitate donations for you. So I would have, hey, donate to my organization, but then when you actually write the check, you're sending it to another organization, and then they keep a small percentage and then send it to me. And then that means there's no disclosures on the part of the organization without a nonprofit entity because you don't exist on paper. And there's no requirement that the organization that's acting as the fiscal sponsor disclose really basically anything. And so that's how Students for Justice in Palestine operates, and a lot of these different groups operate. And so that's one common example that you'll hear about. But then in terms of long-term strategy, I think what these groups are going to learn from the protests is really just how profitable it is. Because this is such a small expense for them. I mean, what do you have to pay for? You're not paying, I don't think they're actually paying the protesters. People say that. I've seen no evidence of that. They actually paid I'll pay you to actually show up.
They were getting paid like $5,000 for 8 hours.
Wow.
Really? That's crazy.
Wow.
Okay, well, then that changes what I said. But in most cases then at least in the United States, we don't know that the protesters are actually like paid operatives. So the expenses are like, maybe they reimburse travel. I've heard of that happening sometimes. But it's primarily just like banners and signs and the food they provide to the encampments and stuff, a little bit of entertainment. And so that's not a big consequence for these groups' annual budgets. Yet they raise a ton of money, and you can tell by the way they keep pumping out the funding requests, saying, oh, we need more, but they don't explain why they actually need more because you're not spending much. So what they're doing is they're getting all these small donations coming in, and I believe then basically having fun with it. You give yourself a raise or you hold on to it, whatever, because there is no need for this additional revenue stream for these protests. So it's a wonderful investment. It's going to become a business strategy. And that's why I think even if these campus protests end soon, they're going to revive because it's just simply profitable. Now, if I may, it's not often I get an opportunity where I have a bunch of heavy hitters who really understand this issue in one room. And I know that there's a craving for a discussion about like what's really impactful. And so just some data points from my study of the individual groups that are involved in these campus protests. I think I did probably the most comprehensive analysis of as many groups as possible, I mean hundreds, involved in these protests. And I very quickly came up with a list of over 100 that I would describe as terror-tied, meaning they, at the very least, openly support terrorism, if not involved in it in some way. And so what was surprising for me from my examination of that data that I collected was that unlike other controversial protests where there's rioting and stuff where we've grown accustomed to shocking people by saying, oh, you won't believe the proportion of organizations that are connected to the far left or are connected to the Islamists, and that's what I expect to happen here. Like, no, this, from the beginning, middle to end, all of them are terror supporters. And this whole thing was concocted. It wasn't like there was this sudden authentic outbreak of protest and then they swooped in. No, they started calling for protests literally the day after the October 7th attacks happened. I mean, while the attacks were going on, they were advertising the next day's attacks, and then it just escalated into what you're seeing today. So it really is a pro-terror operation, even if a lot of the students there are not actually in support of terrorism. But ideologically, the biggest takeaway that I had was that the vast majority of the groups that are involved are actually communist, anarchist, from what we call the far left. Although the more I study it, I think that we need to use some new terminologies to describe what we're actually fighting against, because it actually is detrimental. It's not just an academic point. I think it actually helps them to call them far left. And in terms of the messaging that's going on in the language, I saw basically no sign of Islamic justifications for what they were doing. And so on the one hand, you can say that's a reflection of a strategic decision, and it partially is, that these groups said in order to cast as wide of a net, let's stick to an anti-colonialist narrative, but you're not going to be able to get everyone saying the same thing on social media and at protests and Instagram lives where they're having conversations and don't realize that they're being recorded. And so the absence of Islamic-based justifications really strongly indicates that I think a lot of the power that we would see from the Islamist network has now transferred into this Marxist, Leninist, communist, anarchist type philosophy. And so the situation seems to be that you can have groups like Muslim American Society and others that will get things started, and then don't really need to do anything, and then let the communist type groups come in, and then as it becomes wider, then you'll have the more people a little bit closer to the center getting involved. And so it's making me question, I wonder if we've actually had a certain level of success that we didn't recognize, because these groups have actually said in their directives, don't mention Hamas. And a lot of these groups we've seen that used to be very open about preaching Islamism are censoring themselves very consistently. And so is it possible that we, on the outside, not just in terms of law enforcement, have made it so pricey and risky for them to say anything related to Islamism and supporting terror openly and being recorded by it, that that's actually given way, and Islamism is less of an influence now, particularly for the youth, than a Marxist-Leninist type philosophy. So that seems to be coming together. And one other observation I was saying.
So can I just get back to government funding, as I mentioned? These are astonishing amounts. They're going to groups both that operate lawfully but promote radical ideas, but they're also going to organizations that subsidize terror. Jeff, ideally I'd see the DOJ prosecuting the terror finance, and I'd see some sort of mechanism whereby everyone from Health and Human Services to USAID to State Department can refuse to fund a group if they think they're going to promote distinctly un-American values or something along those lines.
Oh, clearly, yeah.
Now, constitutionally, I understand this is difficult. What is the solution then to the problem of government funding of our enemies, of Islamists?
Yeah, I think we need to draw lines between groups, which is a very hard thing to do, but I remember Holy Land Foundation, to our chagrin, was on the USAID Clean Bill of Health, whatever, the part of the website where it talks, and for its own part, Holy Land Foundation put the USAID stamp on their website, like it was something that was accepted by that. And when we found out about it, we got a hold of, it was actually the USAID people, and they were fairly cavalier about this problem because they felt like we were being too aggressive. But eventually they took it off. But there is, that is a problem when it comes to basically one part of the government not knowing what the other part of the government's doing.
Right. If you had any sway over DOJ now, do you think that's all it requires is a political appointee with some guts, or to get things going?
Political will is what I think is lacking. In answer to one of your questions in the notes, that we could develop political will, and it might develop naturally with what happens in Israel.
And after October 7th, there was a distinct sense I heard from federal agents, and I'm sure your contacts, and indeed you were still with DOJ, right?
Yep.
Back. So my sense, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Biden administration did tell the FBI and others to start looking once again at Hamas networks.
Yeah.
Now, either they're doing that very quietly, and in about 2 years' time we'll start to see some results,
Yeah.
or that's been shut down because there's definitely been a change in mind in political will on this question. So what's your sense?
I couldn't comment. I hadn't seen evidence of that, and so I don't necessarily want to speculate. But but what I would like to see, you talk about silver bullets. I would like to see the Council for American Islamic Relations have to register as a agent of the Muslim Brotherhood.
As a foreign agent, this would be a FARA.
FARA, under FARA. They would have to label all of their literature as propaganda.
Interesting.
If they did that, and they would have to be they would have to own up to the fact that they are representing the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States.
Interesting. Now, Susanna, I'm just going to ask you directly, how much time do we have for questions in the first?
About a half an hour.
Half an hour. In which case, I'd like to spend a few more minutes actually on FARA, and then we'll turn to questions, if that's okay. FARA is very interesting because it's not just, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood. Something we were dealing with last year, 2 years ago now, was a group down in Houston, a Pakistani diaspora group, very closely connected to Kashmiri terrorists. Indeed, their main contact in Kashmir is now Pakistani ambassador to the United States. And his appointment was held up by the US precisely because of these terror-linked concerns. But the interesting thing about the diaspora is that these groups were operating openly on behalf of Imran Khan's government in Pakistan, but also Kashmiri interests and other foreign principals who had nakedly extreme and dangerous ideas. As far as I can tell, none of them were ever registered as foreign agents. And if you look across the country, with the exception of a few exceptions, in the case of Pakistan, there was that one famous FARA case, but for the most part, foreign agents operate with impunity and certainly not registered. The big example very close to here is in Maryland. We have the Diyanet Mosque, which cost $100 million to build and entirely funded by the Turkish regime. And this is from this institution.
Turkish.
Yeah, Turkish regime. And this is from, in fact, the Diyanet is the name of the Directorate of Religious Affairs in Turkey. That's why this mosque is called the Diyanet. Its employees, their salaries are all paid by the Turkish government. Its messaging, its preaching is all pre-approved in Ankara before it's issued here and at the satellite mosques around America. This is a Turkish government institution. Worst off, it's also used by a group called the US Council of Muslim Organizations, or USCMO, as the starting point for their annual Muslim lobbying day. So this is a foreign government institution involved in lobbying domestic
unregistered
Muslim issues. No one wants to prosecute this under FARA law. So is this just the same problem as the DOJ terror finance stuff? There just isn't the political...
No, it's slightly different because FARA is now recognized as an area of aggression within DOJ. It used to be that the remedy for FARA violations was the National Security Division of Justice sending a nasty letter to the group saying, please register. And now we actually have teeth in our approach, and we threaten to prosecute, and we, in many cases, we actually convicted, I think we convicted Paul Manafort of criminal FARA violations. His lawyers threw a tantrum because it was so unheard of. But the Department of Justice is starting to prosecute FARA criminally.
That's interesting. And I remind people in this room that between the groups here today, which really I think we can count on one hand pretty much, that and brave activists involved with these groups, there's no one else doing this work. And this is a global threat, and we're pretty much in this room the only people in America focused on it. It's a very serious threat, and I would like to see tangible ideas based on tangible data guide what we do. Now, the Middle East Forum, as I say, we work obsessively of collecting data. It's really what I spend at least 22 hours a day doing, to the detriment of all my other interests. We can provide a lot of this data. The Capital Research Center is working on data as well, as is a program on extremism. If we can turn this data into action, we can decide how we best use this, whether here in DC or through other means, I think that would best serve our purpose going forward. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.